We often retell the origin story as a rapid sequence of events. God creates Adam and Eve, places them in the Garden of Eden, and just a few lines later, they eat the forbidden fruit and are cast out. There is no waiting, no pause, no stage of growth. Everything unfolds as though failure was inevitable, as though humanity was born ready to fall. But have you ever wondered, was there time in Eden? What happened between the moment of creation and the moment of the fall? Did everything truly occur within a few days? Or are we merely reading a summary, so condensed it distorts the truth? If Eden was a real place, not merely a symbol, then time in Eden must have been real. And if there was time, how long did Adam and Eve live in the light before darkness came? An ancient text excluded from most modern Bibles, the Book of Jubilees, reveals something that shakes the traditional understanding. Adam and Eve lived a full 7 years in the Garden of Eden before they fell in the 8th year, on the 14th day of the 2nd month, according to the heavenly calendar. 7 years, not 7 days, not 7 fleeting moments. A span long enough to live, to learn, to love, and to walk in the divine presence of God. They didn't just live, they kept the Sabbath, understood sacrificial offerings, and learned to move in harmony with the breath of heaven. In those 7 years, Eden wasn't merely a place, it was a spiritual current, a realm where humanity lived in rhythm with divine purpose. Before a fateful day shattered that harmony. If that is true, if mankind once lived a long life in the light before the fall, then this is not only a story of sin, it is a sacred memory lost, a rupture in the timeline where light once ruled. And perhaps the most terrifying thing is not that they were expelled from Eden, but that we no longer remember they lived there for so long, that there was a vast, holy Eden, condensed into a silent paragraph in Scripture. If Adam and Eve lived 7 years in obedience, love, and companionship with God, then it changes everything we believe about the beginning of sin. For centuries, we've been taught the fall happened almost instantly. A burst of weakness, a moment of carelessness, an early mistake. But if they lived long in the light, then it was no naive stumble. It was a hidden battle, a prepared scheme, and ultimately a covenant broken just as it neared fulfillment. The Book of Jubilees clearly states, "On the 14th day of the 2nd month, in the 8th year, Satan came and tempted Eve." That specific date is not random. It was the day they had just entered a new cycle in the sacred calendar. A holy rhythm had been sustained for 7 years, and at the very moment they stepped into a new spiritual season, the fracture occurred. That compels us to ask, what does the 8th day mean? If 7 is the number of completion, of creation, of Sabbath, of covenant, then what is 8? Perhaps the 8th day is the moment humanity was called to step into a deeper level of freedom, not just patterned obedience, but willful choice. And it was at that threshold that Satan intruded, not to ruin a system, but to stop mankind from entering into a mature covenant. We once thought the failure was human, but what if there was truly an enemy watching, counting time and breaking in at the most crucial moment? Then this is no simple moral tale. This is a spiritual war, quiet but precise, crafted from the shadows to sabotage the fullness God was nurturing in humanity. And if that's true, what else in Scripture might have been simplified? How many more eighth days have been hidden? Perhaps we're not just reading history, we're hearing the echo of a sacred memory waiting to be restored. If you open Genesis and read chapters 2 through 3, you'll see a simple sequence. God creates Adam, then Eve. A garden is given, a command is spoken, a serpent appears, a fruit is eaten, mankind is expelled. It all fits neatly into a few dozen verses, enough to retell in 5 minutes to a child. But in that neatness, a more haunting question arises. How long did Adam and Eve live in Eden before the fall? Genesis gives no timeline, not a single verse, not one hint of the years they may have spent living, loving, and tending the sacred garden in peace and light. The absence is so vast, it becomes a deafening silence. And the more closely we read, the more we sense that this silence has cost the story part of its soul. If they lived only a few days, their failure seems understandable. But if they lived many years in covenant, then the eating of the fruit was no impulsive act. It was the result of a long battle, a tested process, a heartbeat broken. And that is the part Genesis doesn't tell. Perhaps it once did, in a now lost chapter. Or perhaps it is a sacred memory that later generations chose not to preserve. When you look at a ruined castle, the first thing you see is the collapse. But if you're patient enough to dig, you'll uncover the foundation, and maybe even the soaring architecture that once stood in light. So it is with Eden. We only see the fruit taken and the exile, but what came before? What kind of intimacy allowed God to walk in the garden in the cool of the day? What made Eden so alive, now reduced to mere symbol? The answer may lie in the forgotten words, or in texts removed from the canon, like the Book of Jubilees, where Eden is not just memory, but real time, with calendars, seasons, and sacred days, and a love more enduring than we ever imagined. The Book of Jubilees, a sacred text preserved in the Ethiopian tradition for thousands of years, recounts a detail that changes the whole story of the fall. Adam and Eve lived in the Garden of Eden for a full 7 years, according to God's calendar. And only in the 8th year, on the 14th day of the 2nd month, did they sin. A clear timeline, detailed to the day, something Genesis never mentions. But what's striking isn't only the number of years, it's how time was measured. In Jubilees, time does not follow the moon like the calendars of neighboring peoples, nor is it simply marked by harvest cycles. It is the calendar of heaven, a sacred rhythm guarded by angels, and humanity was originally taught to live by that rhythm. Jubilees emphasizes that Eden wasn't just a place with trees, streams, and forbidden fruit. It was a consecrated realm shaped by sacred time. Each day wasn't repetition, but a complete cycle of meaning, of Sabbath, of offerings, of covenant. That time was measured by God's presence, by His coming down at sacred moments to speak with humanity. So what happened when Adam and Eve stepped into the 8th year? Why did the 14th of the 2nd month become the turning point? In the holy calendar, the 8th year marks a new cycle, a step from training into maturity, from learning into free will. And at that exact moment, darkness intervened, not by accident, at the appointed time, as if Satan wasn't merely a tempter, but one who knew heaven's calendar and waited for the covenant's moment of greatest vulnerability. If that's true, then what we now call calendar, the meaningless passing of months and days, was once the living heartbeat of the cosmos. A rhythm both humans and angels walked in. And when that holy calendar was replaced, when its cycles were distorted, when Sabbath was no longer rightly understood, then the fall wasn't just Adam's personal collapse. It was humanity slipping off its divine axis. Could it be that what we lost wasn't merely a garden, but the very sense of sacred time? And if so, Eden, and the memory of Eden, wasn't sealed off with flaming swords. It was slowly erased when we stopped counting days by God's rhythm. The Book of Jubilees doesn't just say Adam and Eve lived 7 years in Eden. It describes a world not yet fractured, an Eden where the divine order remained intact, where time, light, and meaning were one. In those 7 years, they didn't live passively like innocent children. They were taught, trained, and raised as the first living souls growing up in the arms of God. They learned the Sabbath law, the sacred day of rest even the angels observe. They were instructed in the offering of pure sacrifices, not to atone, but to express gratitude and connect with the Creator. They didn't just live in a garden, they lived in a cosmic temple, where every day was a prayer, every action a sacred rite. Jubilees describes the first festivals, seasons appointed by God, not based on the moon or climate, but on the holy architecture of time. Adam and Eve didn't merely eat and harvest. They lived by cycles, by the breath of the universe. Each week ended in a Sabbath. Each year held consecrated days, and every moment was defined by the presence of God. This calls us to rethink the entire story. Adam and Eve were not a naive couple making a childish mistake. They were knowledgeable beings, trained by God. They lived with Him, learned from Him, and walked in the light. If they fell, it was not for lack of understanding, but due to a deeper rupture, a blow to the very harmony between man and heaven. So what really happened? Who or what shattered the sacred balance built over 7 years? Why did a world turning in perfect rhythm with the heavens collapse in a single moment? Was there another hand, one that knew the sacred calendar, knew human weakness, and waited for that exact moment to strike the first crack? If today's world is in chaos because we've forgotten how to live in rhythm with God's breath, then perhaps Eden is not only the place we once lost, but the way of life we must learn again. Perhaps in those 7 years, Adam and Eve lived as a model for something far greater than we've ever dared to believe. The fundamental difference between how Genesis describes Adam and Eve and how the Book of Jubilees recounts their story is not only in the length of time, but in the very nature of life in Eden. According to Jubilees, Adam and Eve were not merely created to live, but to learn, to be trained, to grow in the light. Eden was not just a dwelling, it was a sacred school where God and the angels taught humanity how to live as citizens of the heavenly realm. In those first 7 years, they did not live aimlessly. They knew the laws, not laws of constraint, but laws of rhythm, Sabbath, festivals, sacred cycles. They lived according to a divine system where every action carried cosmic meaning. Adam didn't just tend a garden, he guarded a holy space. Eve wasn't merely a companion, she became the symbol of the communion between earth and heaven. They were taught how to walk before God in reverence and joy, not as children, but as souls growing into the recipients of an eternal covenant. Jubilees makes it clear they lived in sync with the Sabbath rhythm, not merely observing the seventh day, but immersing themselves in the structure of sacred time where every week, every month, every year was part of a divine symphony. Like the angels above, Adam and Eve didn't just live, they worshipped through their very presence, obedient and deeply aware. They were not passive, nor were they easily deceived as many assume. They were taught. They were given wisdom. They knew what was holy and what was forbidden. In this Edenic model, humanity did not begin from nothing, but from light, from order, and from a divine invitation to become like God. They weren't caught in a tragic accident. They were central characters in a sacred journey, guided, empowered, and placed at the heart of God's creative plan. And precisely because they were taught, because they lived in perfect order for 7 years, the rupture that followed could not have been accidental. It was a deliberate attack on a model that was working, a divine blueprint, the very first system God gave to humanity. The Book of Jubilees records, "On the 14th day of the 2nd month, in the 8th year, Satan appeared to tempt Eve." That was not a coincidence, not a random moment in the garden. It was a carefully chosen strategic point in time, marking a shift in the sacred timeline. It was the beginning of a new cycle in the holy calendar, when humanity had just completed their first 7 years of living fully in covenant and light. Those 7 years were not just time. They were a season of training, a period of soul preparation to step into the role of spiritual maturity. And right at that moment, the 8th day, when innocence gives way to responsibility, Satan stepped in. No longer the simple serpent described in Genesis. According to extra-biblical Jewish texts like 1 Enoch, Jubilees, and the Midrash traditions, Satan is a being of knowledge, of strategy, who understands the heavenly calendar and knows the weaknesses of man. He is not merely a tempter, but a breaker of divine structure, interfering at the precise moment when the sacred rhythm of creation was about to shift. The 8th day was not meant to be the day of the fall. It was supposed to be the day of transition, when Adam and Eve would step into a new depth of covenant, where they would no longer merely follow, but begin to choose a life of faithfulness to God with mature will. And Satan knew it. He did not attack from the beginning. He waited for the change of season, when the human heart might waver under the test of true freedom. Thus, this was not a moral accident. This was an attack on the most sacred of moments, like interrupting a holy ordination, like tearing down a temple just as the sacrifice is about to begin. It was not just temptation, it was sabotage of humanity's entrance into its divine destiny, to become like God, not only in form, but in the free, responsible power to choose. If you've ever thought the fall was an accidental stumble, Jubilees reminds us we are witnessing a theological war, where a force of darkness deliberately struck at the very nature of the time covenant between God and humanity. Reading the full timeline as described in the Book of Jubilees, we no longer see Eden as a peaceful garden like the imagination of children. Eden was a front line, a space both sacred and vulnerable. Not merely the beginning of life, but the meeting point of unseen forces, light and darkness, God and a hidden enemy. Satan did not strike at random. He chose the moment between cycles when the first 7-year phase had ended, the phase of preparation, of training, of obedient living. That moment, according to the sacred calendar, marked a spiritual coming of age, when Adam and Eve were stepping into a higher role like the first priests of humanity. And just as they were about to be entrusted with this role, darkness moved. The fall was not a slip. It was the rupture of a chain of light, the breaking of a holy rhythm built over 7 years. Day after day, Adam and Eve lived by God's time, keeping Sabbath, offering sacrifice, worshipping not only with reverence, but with understanding. They had been trained not to fall, but to stand. Yet Eden, though the meeting place with God, was also a hot spot, where cosmic forces contended in silence. The truth is, Satan knew what man did not. He understood the holy calendar. He knew the 7 years were foundation, and the 8th year was the doorway into true spiritual responsibility. He didn't attack at the start. He waited for the sacred moment to break the rhythm, the structure, and the meaning. That is why the fall was not just sin. It was a strategic failure in the first spiritual war. Eden, through the lens of Jubilees, is no longer a passive space. It is a spiritual battleground where God created man in his image and where darkness sought to prevent man from completing that role. Sin, in its deepest sense, is not just doing wrong. It is being pulled out of God's rhythm, letting another voice intrude into the sacred silence, breaking a covenant that was just beginning to mature. If you see Eden as a quiet garden, you won't understand how a single act could alter all of history. But if you see Eden as the front line between heaven and all that opposes it, then you will understand. Every small choice made in the light is a weapon against the darkness. It is hard to believe that an event that changed the fate of all humanity is told in just a few brief lines. In Genesis, the eating of the forbidden fruit is presented as a moment. The serpent speaks, the woman listens, the man agrees, God appears, punishment is declared, and humanity is banished. End of story. One chapter in the Bible, a few passing lines. But that brevity is the deepest cut. It flattens the entire spiritual depth into a simple moral symbol. When Eden is reduced to a lesson about not disobeying God, the cosmic dimension, with sacred time, with festival laws, with divine presence stretched over years, is washed away into oblivion. Eden was once a carefully established world, with a calendar, with cycles, with Sabbath, with angelic instruction, with sacrificial laws. But all of it has now become blank space between the lines, a memory so reduced it seems as though it never existed. What we've lost is not just information, but a model of life, a pattern in which humanity once lived truly with God, in step with the breath of the cosmos, and in harmony with its own soul. We have not only forgotten Eden, we have forgotten that we once lived in the light long before we fell. Jubilees doesn't merely add detail, it restores depth that was flattened. It reveals that the fall was not the beginning, but the result of years lived rightly, followed by a confrontation between two invisible forces. And in that battle, humanity was not lacking knowledge, but lacking vigilance. Not because they didn't know right from wrong, but because they didn't realize an enemy had been waiting for their change of season. When we forget the depth, we forget the responsibility. And when truth is reduced to symbols, it loses the power to transform the soul. Perhaps it's time we not only reread the story, but dig beneath those brief lines to recover the radiant memory humanity once lived, once guarded, and then lost. If Adam and Eve didn't sin immediately after being created, if they truly lived 7 years in the light, then our entire concept of beginning must be rewritten. We have grown used to viewing Eden as a fleeting phase, a prelude to the larger story of redemption. But if Eden was real, enduring, and sacred, then Eden is the center, the original template, the very thing humanity is being called to return to. And if that sacred time was shortened, what else may have been blurred? What details were omitted for being too complex? What truths were withheld for not fitting later religious paradigms? How many sacred realities, like the Sabbath laws, the heavenly calendar, the spiritual training, have been simplified into symbols instead of preserved as living memory? The danger lies not only in what we do not know, but in what we think we know and know wrongly. Eden was not merely a space. It was a stage, a system, a rhythm of ordered living with memory, with depth. And if Jubilees is right, the one who broke Eden was not merely a serpent, but a force of darkness aiming to shatter that memory. What memory? The memory that humanity once lived rightly with God, that we once knew the sacred calendar, once kept Sabbath as the angels did, once offered sacrifice with untainted hearts, once walked in a garden with no shadow. That is not fantasy. That is heavenly memory. And perhaps that memory is the true target of the enemy. When that memory is erased, when Eden becomes a vague metaphor, when the Sabbath is replaced by market days, when time becomes nothing more than a cycle of labor, humanity no longer remembers where it came from. And if we don't know how we once lived, how can we possibly know where we are meant to return? The Book of Jubilees does not merely retell the story. It touches the very things we have forgotten we once possessed. And if any part of that past is true, then we must be brave enough to ask deeper questions about everything else. What has been shortened, and what is still waiting to be restored? Genesis, with all its detail in describing creation, is completely silent about the first 7 years of Adam and Eve's life. Not a single sentence, not a phrase, not even a hint that tells us how long they lived in the Garden of Eden before the fall. The silence is so stark, it forces us to stop and ask, was that silence accidental or intentional? Could this be a sacred blank space, a gap God reserved for those willing to seek? Like how he doesn't speak directly about the kingdom of heaven, but tells parables so that only the truly hungry will understand. Could this silence be a hidden door, so that the reader is not only receiving, but also digging, questioning, and journeying into a buried memory? Or is it the opposite? Could it be the trace of an ancient censorship, when the original story may have been fuller, but some parts were removed, shortened, or spiritualized into abstract symbols, making it easier to control theologically? Jubilees speaks of God's calendar, a calendar based on solar cycles, dividing time into sacred weeks, where angels and humans alike kept the Sabbath. But that calendar was replaced by the lunar calendar, more convenient for agriculture, but misaligned with the rhythms of heaven. Could it be that when the sacred calendar was replaced, the sacred memory faded with it? And the silence in Genesis is not a lack, but the result of a deep restructuring of the system, where not only time, but also truth was reshaped to fit another vision, a religion centered more on outward form than on living in spiritual rhythm. If so, then that silence is not merely a void, it is a scar from a memory lost. A warning that perhaps the most important things are not found in what is spoken, but in what is kept silent. And when we begin to dig again, like when we discover Jubilees, we are not just uncovering a story, we are uncovering a sacred language that had once been forgotten. If you ever thought Eden was just a garden, the Book of Jubilees will make you think again. In it, Eden is described not just as humanity's first dwelling place, but as a center of sacred worship, where angels taught, where Adam and Eve lived no differently than citizens of the high heavens. They didn't merely exist, they lived according to the sacred calendar, to the rhythm God had set even before the foundations of the world. Time in Eden did not flow by the moon or sun, but by a spiritual breath. Each week had a Sabbath day, a day kept by both angels and humans. Each month, each year bore holy marks, not to track labor, but to mark divine presence. Within that rhythm, humanity didn't just know what was right. They lived in deep harmony with God, with the cosmos, and with their own souls. This was the original world, not a naive world, but a world in rhythm with the heavens. And the peace came not from rigid law, but from a structure of sacred time, where everything was aligned to its place, its moment, its meaning. When people lived according to the sacred calendar, they didn't have to strive to live rightly, because time itself carried them into the flow of holiness. But what happens when that calendar is broken? Jubilees does not portray the fall as merely a personal mistake. It was the result of a system under attack, a cycle disrupted, a structure of light infiltrated by darkness. When Adam and Eve stepped out of the sacred calendar, when they chose to follow another voice, another timing, the rupture did not stop with them, but echoed through the entire divine structure where they had stood at the center. That's why the consequence of the fall wasn't only expulsion from a garden, it was the loss of their right to live within God's time. From that moment, humanity began living by its own time, a time out of sync, off rhythm, spinning through seasons without knowing which days were holy and which were ordinary. You may have never thought of time as a form of worship, but according to Jubilees, to live rightly in time is to live rightly with God. And Eden, though lost, still stands as a witness that we once lived in a world designed so that the soul always knew where it was and to whom it belonged. Jubilees 3:17 gives us one short but weighty sentence. On the 14th day of the second month in the 8th year, Satan came to tempt Eve. A line that records an event, but read carefully, and it does more than describe an action. It marks time. And that time was not just any day. It was the threshold of a season in the sacred calendar, the moment when an old cycle had just ended and a new one was about to begin. The first 7 years of Adam and Eve were not playful days in a lush garden. They were 7 years of spiritual training, living by Sabbath law, offering thanksgiving sacrifices, learning obedience and responsibility. It was a time designed to shape a complete human being, not only in the image of God in form, but in discernment, in choice, in covenant keeping. And as the 8th year began, specifically on the 14th of the second month, they were about to enter the next phase of covenant. A stage where God would no longer hold their hand through every step, but begin to entrust them with authority, to truly live as stewards of the earth, as his representatives among creation. But right at that moment, Satan stepped in, not because he wandered in by chance, but because he knew God's structure of time and chose that precise moment to break it. This was not a carnal temptation. This was a strategic assault, calculated, intentional, timed. Like sabotaging an ordination ceremony when a soul is just ready to take on sacred responsibility. Like pulling down a priest at the doorstep of the holy place. Satan didn't stop Adam and Eve from learning. He let them finish, then shattered the moment of their graduation. We often think demons thrive in chaos, but many times, as in Eden, the enemy works within order and intervenes only when the timing is ripe. That's what makes him so dangerous. He understands how covenant works and seeks to destroy it from the inside. If the fall had happened at the beginning, it would be easier to accept as a naive first mistake. But when it happens after 7 years of faithfulness, on the threshold of spiritual maturity, it becomes a tragedy of history, orchestrated by one who understands heaven's breath more deeply than we do. Adam and Eve did not fall because they were naive. They were not immature souls lured by a simple lie. They had lived 7 years in the light, trained, instructed, taught to discern between holy and profane, between light and darkness. And because of that, their fall was not a moral misstep. It was a fracture in the very structure of sacred time. They were struck at the most sacred moment, the seasonal threshold, where humanity was poised to enter a deeper dimension of covenant. It wasn't a moment of weakness. It was a moment of transformation, where free will met its first great test. And right at that moment, Satan stepped in, not with violence, but with a suggestion that lured them away from God's calendar, from the rhythm they had walked in with the Creator. The problem was never the fruit. It was never just about to eat or not to eat. The fruit was a symbol. The real issue was the broken rhythm. When humanity acted by another voice at another time on another cycle, they lost alignment with the heavenly kingdom. They stepped out of heaven's calendar, out of the flow of light. And with that, the entire structure collapsed. The fall, in the light of Jubilees, is a dissonance in sacred time. When Adam and Eve stepped out of the cycle they had kept for 7 years, they didn't merely break a rule, they lost the very notion of time as a form of worship. They no longer knew what a holy day was. They couldn't discern the hour of presence from the hour of temptation. They lost their soul sense of time. From then on, time became something physical to be measured, not a covenantal rhythm. Time ceased to be sacred and simply flowed, and humanity, out of sync, began living in a world where days no longer connected to heaven, but only to toil, fear, and the endless cycle of survival. If we understand this, we will realize the fall was not just the start of sin, but the rupture of a covenant of time when humanity forgot Eden's first breath. In the Book of Jubilees, there is one often overlooked but crucial detail. The angels kept the Sabbath from the very beginning. Not only for themselves, but they taught Adam and Eve to keep it too as part of the sacred covenant. This tells us that from the dawn of creation, the Sabbath was not a later human law. It was a cosmic rhythm shared between heaven and earth. Eden, then, was not merely a place of dwelling, it was the first liturgical structure of humanity, an open temple where angels and humans worshipped God together, not with blood sacrifices, but with synchronization, presence, and meaningful silence. When Adam and Eve kept the Sabbath, they were not merely resting, they were living within the structure of the Most High. The presence of angels in Eden was not symbolic. It was a sign that Eden was positioned between two worlds, a place where the visible met the invisible, where time flowed more slowly, more sacredly, where every moment was a chance to encounter the Creator. And for that reason, when the fall happened, it was not merely a human act, but a blow to the central bridge between heaven and earth. That rupture, that step away from Sabbath, that fall out of rhythm, was a strike against the order of creation. It didn't just remove humanity from the garden, it severed the stream of communication with the angels, obscured the sacred seasons, and made the Sabbath, the heartbeat of the cosmos, fade and eventually be replaced. The fall, from this perspective, was the first spiritual war, not between man and serpent, but between God and the force seeking to break the rhythm of creation's breath. It was the first rebellion against heaven's calendar, the first effort to insert humanity into another rhythm, a godless schedule where days lost their meaning and the soul gradually forgot the hour when God used to walk among them. If we truly understand this, then restoration after the fall is not merely about forgiveness, it is about the recovery of an original rhythm of life, where humanity knew how to pause, how to breathe with heaven, and how to listen for the footsteps of God in those quiet Friday evenings that never truly disappeared. When we speak of Eden, we often think of a place that was lost. A garden locked away, a paradise with no road back. But the truth is even more painful. It's not only Eden that was lost, it is the memory of Eden that has been forgotten. Humanity was not merely expelled from a garden, we were severed from the memory of how we once lived rightly with God. This changes the entire story, because something lost can be found again, but something forgotten may never be spoken of again. And if it weren't for the Book of Jubilees, we would never know that Adam and Eve once lived 7 years in the light, 7 years in covenant, in Sabbath faithfulness, in sync with heaven's breath. The fall didn't happen right away. It happened after humanity had already known how to live in holiness, and then forgot. It is a paradox. While nearly every religion emphasizes sin, very few speak of the time before sin. That time is not a blank space. It is the soul's most precious memory. Because only when we remember that we once lived in the light can we truly understand the depth of the darkness, and only when we recall the old rhythm can we rediscover the path home. But that memory has faded as time ceased to revolve around the Sabbath, as the sacred calendar was replaced by agricultural calendars, imperial schedules, and administrative time, as days began to be measured by labor rather than presence. Eden became a myth rather than a spiritual origin point. Humanity was not just banished, we were redefined. And now the question is no longer theological, it becomes personal. Could it be that you too once lived in the light, but have forgotten? Perhaps you once had a carefree childhood, a season when your life aligned with conscience, a time when your soul knew how to listen. when to pause, when to be silent, when to return. If Eden was ever real, and if that memory once lived in the human soul, then restoration may not begin with seeking something new, but by remembering something old, recovering a memory, a breath, a light we once lived in, then lost, and then forgot we ever had. If Adam and Eve once lived 7 years in the light, walked daily in God's presence, lived fully aligned with heaven's rhythm, then that isn't just a story about the past. It opens a question for your present. Could you be living your own 7 luminous years without even realizing it? You may be in a season of peace, a quiet stage of preparation, where you are being taught, being led, being made ready for something greater. Perhaps the time you feel unused, uncertain, or waiting is actually the time you are living in Eden, a personal Eden, quiet but radiant. And because that peace won't last forever, you must heed the warning of Jubilees. Satan doesn't act immediately. He waits. He waits for the 8th day, when you are about to cross into a new phase, when you are ready to be entrusted with greater spiritual authority. That's when the attack comes, not with loud screams, but with whispers. Not from the beginning, but right at the threshold of spiritual maturity. The 7 years of Adam and Eve are not just history, they are a pattern, a hidden rhythm that each of us passes through. Time nourished in light, free of rush, free of judgment. Time to learn how to live rightly, not perfectly, but solidly enough to stand when testing comes. So ask yourself, where are you on that timeline? Are you in your years of light but discouraged because nothing is happening? Or are you approaching the 8th day and unaware that you must now stay alert? Jubilees is not just an ancient tale. It reminds you that God's calendar is still ticking, and your life, though it may seem small, is possibly unfolding within an Eden. A quiet Eden, cared for by God, waiting for you to notice and live it fully. Perhaps the most profound truth that the Book of Jubilees offers is not found in details or dates, but in a gentle declaration. Eden was never locked, it was forgotten, because Eden is not a fixed place on a map, not a physical garden lost in a flood or a divine expulsion. Eden is a rhythm of life, a sacred timeline that humanity once walked in and then lost step. Jubilees doesn't describe Eden merely with trees and forbidden fruit, but with the sacred calendar, with Sabbath, with alignment to heaven's rhythm. Eden is where each morning is an invitation, each evening a whisper of God's footsteps. When Adam and Eve lived according to heaven's time, kept the holy days, followed the cycles, they weren't just in the garden, they were a part of Eden. And when that cycle broke, Eden didn't collapse instantly. It faded, disappeared from human memory, not because it was closed, but because we forgot how to live in its rhythm. When Sabbath was no longer kept, when time ceased to be sacred, when the calendar became only a work schedule, Eden vanished. No one locked the gate, but no one remembered the way back. And that is the true tragedy. Eden was never forbidden. It was forgotten. But if you listen deeply, you may still hear it. Hear it in those moments when your soul slows down, when time no longer rushes, when you suddenly remember something ancient, peaceful, pure, when you stop in the middle of life and hear something like footsteps. Perhaps Eden is breathing through you. The Eden story never ended. It waits to continue in the life of one who listens. And if you learn to live again by God's calendar, not through law, but through the desire to align with Him, then Eden can return, not out there, but within you. Because wherever a soul lives rightly with God, there Eden reopens. The story you've just heard may have taken place thousands of years ago. A sacred garden, a first human, an invitation, a choice, and then a fall that rippled through history. But the more haunting truth may be that we have forgotten we once lived so long in the light. Adam and Eve were not just a beginning, they are a reflection of us. They lived in Eden, not for a few fleeting days, but for 7 clean, full years in step with God. And when the sacred calendar was broken, they didn't just lose a location, they lost memory. They lost the sense of what it meant to live rightly, lost the ability to recognize the light they once knew, lost the soul's first home. Today, many live as if Eden never existed. They read scripture as folklore. They see Eden as a distant symbol. But Jubilees reminds us, perhaps Eden was never fully closed. It only faded when no one remembered the way. And that may be the most sobering thought of all. What if you are walking through a sacred garden and don't even realize it? Maybe you are in a season of light, a protected time of formation, but your mind is fixated on what hasn't yet happened. You don't see that you are already in Eden because you are waiting for a paradise of your imagination and miss the one that is whispering through your ordinary days. Jubilees is not just an ancient text, it is a wake-up call, awakening forgotten memory, awakening a soul that once lived in divine rhythm, once breathed in sync with heaven. And now it poses a soft but deep question. Where are you living in your timeline? Maybe you haven't been cast out of Eden. Maybe you've just forgotten you're still in it. Pause for a moment and ask yourself, what have you believed about Adam? That he was a weak man tripping over a smooth lie, a figure blamed for all of humanity's sorrow. And now, after hearing this story, what has caused you to reconsider? If what you just heard stirred something deep within you, a blurry memory, a familiar feeling you can't name, then perhaps you've heard not just a lesson, but a wake-up call, an invitation to look again at the time you're living, to reflect on how you're walking each day. Is there rhythm? Are you breathing with God? Are you holding on to even a fragment of Eden within your heart? If this video opened a new door for you, a door into a forgotten depth, like, subscribe, and share it with someone you believe is also seeking the light. Because what they may be missing isn't an answer, but a memory of a place they once belonged to, an Eden that never truly closed, only hasn't been knocked on for far too long. And remember, some stories never close. They don't stay still on pages. They don't end at the last sentence. They live quietly in how we choose to live each day, in each breath, in how we keep the holy day, in whether we dare to pause and hear God's footsteps in the evening. This story, though it began millennia ago, doesn't end here, because it's knocking on something very real, very human within your heart. And when this video ends, the next question no longer belongs to the past. It belongs to you right now, the story of Eden. Where will it continue, if not within your own heart? Amen.